of course, physicists would, they would love to be able to imagine these things in a more concrete way, but they don't assume that if human imagination runs out, then reality runs out. I mean, they're willing to accept the idea that there may be aspects of reality which we just can't picture, and I think we should be willing to do that in logic as well as in physics.
Welcome, everyone, to today's interview, where we are very pleased to welcome Professor Timothy Williamson. He is Wykeham Professor of Logic at Oxford University. His research focuses primarily on epistemology, logic, metaphysics, and the philosophy of language. His books include Vagueness, Knowledge and Its Limits, Modal Logic as Metaphysics, and several others. He also has a variety of published articles. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome and thanks so much for being here, Professor Williamson.
Well, nice to be here.
Awesome. So as a first question, something a bit more metaphilosophical. So you've long been critical of more deflationary or skeptical views of metaphysics and philosophy more generally. What would you say to someone in order to dispel them of thought, if they had it, that many metaphysical or philosophical disputes, either aren't really substantive, or that we should focus our energy more on language?
Well, I think one place to get started is that philosophy has quite a lot of overlap with other disciplines. For example, the philosophy of physics and highly theoretical physics, overlap. It's sometimes pretty much the same people doing these things, and so it's clear that the theoretical physicists are not just discussing purely verbal questions, that they're discussing questions in some very broad sense about the nature of reality. And when they're having a conversation with philosophers of physics about these subjects, they're not talking past each other. They're on the same page. And so the philosophers of physics are also not. They're talking about these questions about, in a very broad sense, the nature of reality, for example, the nature of space and time or something like that. And so, in cases like that, it's really pretty obvious that there isn't some amazing difference between the natural science and philosophy in its subject matter. And you get the same thing in, if you compare, say, philosophy of biology and highly theoretical biology, and if you compare the philosophy of mathematics with certain kinds of mathematics, very foundational mathematics, and this is also true not just on in these, as well, with the very exact sciences, but it would also be the case that, for example, you get this in theoretical economics, where a lot of the kind of questions that theoretical economists are interested in about, for example, the ideas of common knowledge and shared information. Those are also ideas that are studied subjects which are studied in philosophy under the heading of epistemic logic, which is a kind of formal sort of epistemology. And so, when you see those connections, it becomes actually slightly ludicrous to claim that once you move from philosophy into some, neighboring or even overlapping disciplines, suddenly the nature of the questions that you're asking becomes radically radically different. I mean, I've been involved in some of these sort of interdisciplinary conversations, and it's just clear that that is not what's going on. And I think it's also the case that large parts of philosophy in the 20th century were concerned with this kind of linguistic approach to philosophy, and so the idea that that philosophical questions are basically linguistic questions. Lots of people tried to make sense of it in the 20th century. People like Carnap and Wittgenstein and so on. And I think what turned out to be the case was that they tried to understand that these as basically questions about conceptual connections or something like that, and the trouble was that in order to have a theory of conceptual connections, you've got to have some kind of theory about what concepts are, and when a word expresses, when two words express the same concept and when they express different concepts, and that kind of the sort of background theory of concepts that you would need to make sense of that, and never worked out properly. I mean, it's based on misconceptions about the nature of language and about what kind of linguistic rules there are. So I think it's also that as well the whole sort of project of trying to separate a special bunch of questions as conceptual questions, which are different from anything that's being asked, in the other sides. It actually has just been a failure. I mean, there are still people trying to make it work, but I don't think any of them has succeeded.
Right. So, I mean, that makes a lot of that makes sense, I think. Although, even if two things I wanted to note. One, on the sort of earlier thing, even if we think that, not all of philosophy is this sort of verbal dispute and not substantive for some other reason or something like that. Maybe some of it at least is substantive, especially around the overlap with other disciplines, maybe. But someone might still think that there's still a fair amount of it that isn't even still.
Well, I mean,
that sort of response.
So it's true that in philosophy we do spend some time quite often in clarifying the sense in which we're using words and so on. But that's something that also happens in other disciplines. I mean, physicists had to separate different senses of the term mass, and you could have medieval historians who might be in a debate about what exactly the term feudalism should be understood to mean, and so on. So that sort of clarification is just something that you expect at a theoretical level in any kind of discussion. So it's not something peculiar about philosophy. And I think also when you look at what goes on with this clarification, it often turns out that it's really just part and parcel of theoretical investigation, and it's not just a matter of deciding on a definition. So I mean an example of that is that when in the philosophy of mathematics, people talk about what's meant by the word set, because theory of sets is often regarded as the most fundamental branch of mathematics, which sort of provides some kind of framework for pretty much the rest of mathematics. I mean, and then if you want to clarify what's meant by the word set, I mean, mathematicians, they don't have a definition of set in more fundamental terms normally. I mean, the way it's clarified is by producing some really informative axioms which tell you a lot about sets, and then using those axioms you can reason about sets. But the axioms, I mean, they're substantive principles, and it's not actually been established beyond any possible doubt that these axioms are even consistent. And I think in general, this process of clarification, it doesn't go on in a kind of void. It's because, at a certain stage in inquiry, some particular unclarity starts to really be obstructive and for progress. And so, terms need to be clarified in specific ways. But it's not just all purpose trying to make everything clear for all possible purposes. And so that even that process of clarification, it really only makes sense within an overall theoretical inquiry. And then it's just, as I say, philosophers do it, but so do other people. So it's not something peculiar about philosophy.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And on a related note, you've also argued against another somewhat common criticism of philosophy, that it involves some sort of special sense of intuition or imaginative faculty. And part of your response there involved that, no, a lot of this thinking is just making use of already ubiquitous sort of counterfactual reasoning, among other things. And I was wondering, like, someone might say that, yeah, okay, so there's counterfactual reasoning in philosophy and elsewhere, but nevertheless, there are these intuitions that are playing a significant role, more of a role in assessing these philosophical problems than in other domains. So, for example, in that paper that I'm thinking of, you talk about Gettier cases and knowledge, and it's one thing to say that we're evaluating certain counterfactuals when considering these various accounts, but another to say that, well, this doesn't count as knowledge, or this does count as knowledge in this counterfactual scenario. And that, I mean, that might be just a matter of intuition, what answer we give there, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, well, let's sort of go through an example in relation to the issue that you raised about Gettier cases for knowledge. So these are meant to be cases where you have a justified true belief in something, but it doesn't count as knowledge, and so that if that's right, that refutes the attempted analysis of knowledge as justified true belief. So a pretty simple example of a Gettier case is one that's in a way goes back to Bertrand Russell, although he used it for slightly different purposes. But it's someone who passes a clock, and the clock says 3 o'clock, and so they form a justified belief that it's 3 o'clock, and as a matter of fact, it is 3 o'clock. So it's also a justified true belief. But what I haven't yet told you is that the clock has stopped, but they didn't see that it had stopped, and they just took one glance at it and saw the time. And so it's pure coincidence that it stopped, sort of maybe exactly 24 hours before the time that that the person is looking at it, and so it does give you the right time of day. And so most people would judge, well, the person doesn't know that it's 3 o'clock, because you can't know what the time is by looking at a clock that stopped some time ago. So, and now some people would say, oh, that's a special philosophical intuition that the guy doesn't know. But I mean, one thing to notice about this is that, of course, I've presented this as, a fiction or if you like, a kind of factual story. But there's no particular reason why we shouldn't do this as a thought experiment in real life. I mean, we could put a clock that had stopped somewhere, and then we could watch people going past, and maybe we could see somebody setting their watch by this clock and so on, and then we could just make it as an observation about that guy, that he doesn't know that it's 3 o'clock, even though it is, or he has justified true belief. And so that wouldn't be something magical or even counterfactual or whatever. And it's just an observation about that person. And so it's like if I were to say that that the people viewing this interview they don't know whether I have or they don't know how many coins I have in my pocket, for example. I mean, obviously the case that how could they know just by watching the podcast? And that's, but you don't need to be a philosopher to have this special intuition that they don't know how many coins are in my pocket. I mean, that's just a piece of it's very ordinary knowledge about ignorance, that that they know that they're ignorant of that rather trivial fact. And if we were to observe the guy setting his watch by the stop clock, we could also in the same way we could notice that well, fairly clearly he doesn't know what the time is, because the clock has stopped. And it would be sort of ridiculous to say that just a completely commonplace observation of that kind counts as a special philosophical intuition. And then all that's happening when we do a thought experiment is that we're basically carrying out the same thing, but in our imaginations. That's where we're simulating the example rather than actually observing it. But once you think about actually observing the case, you realize it wouldn't really be worth setting up a case like that, because it wouldn't tell us anything that we didn't already know, because we already know what that situation is just by thinking about it. And so when you think through what's going on in these cases, you realize that it's simply some fairly ordinary knowledge about what would be the case in some possible circumstances, but gained in a kind of, it's like an offline version of the online knowledge that we get when we actually observe somebody in that situation. And and that kind of thing, there's nothing distinctively philosophical, except that the example, it happens to be interesting because it's a counterexample to something that some philosophers said, but it's not in itself specially philosophical. And so, I think once you take apart what's going on in these cases, you realize that talking about philosophical intuitions is just a very kind of pretentious way of dressing up something that's extremely ordinary and is happening all the time. It's just, it doesn't always happen to be, in cases that are relevant to some mistaken philosophical theory.
Yeah. So maybe the criticism might be that okay, there's nothing really special about these intuitions, and you can have intuitions in other domains, of course, and that can deliver substantive results. But maybe the criticism might be that there's more of a very heavy reliance on them in philosophy, more so than in others, right? The substantive conclusions that we think we're drawing, say, I don't know, what knowledge is and so on, rely heavily upon the results of these intuitions in these cases. What do you think about that? Well,
so we have to think a bit about what counts as an intuition. I think a sort of reasonable view is, I don't really like the word intuition because I think it makes things sound much more mysterious than they really are. But psychologists use the word intuition. But what they mean by it is really just a judgment that is made without conscious reflection. So we, when we just judge, that's not knowledge. We're not going through, as it were, a conscious mental calculation. There may be, as it were, all kinds of unconscious calculation going on, but nothing conscious. And so for psychologists, it would also be, an intuition would also be a normal perceptual judgment, because normally, if I, for example, I just judge that there are some white flowers, which I can see from where I am. I mean, that's, I didn't go through any conscious reflection. I could just see them, and then I'd make this judgment. So that would also be an intuition. So, so any, if we're using it in the kind of psychologically respectable way, intuition is an extremely broad category. And in fact, when you think it through, you realize that any non-intuitive judgment will have to rest on intuitive judgments, because, so for example, a nice case is where you do, let's say, a calculation in your head, you add up some numbers in your head or something like that. So that when you do that, that is a piece of conscious reflection. I mean, it's something that you are aware of doing. There's kind of inference as you go through the steps of the calculation. But the, when you analyze a calculation, you can break it down into steps which don't themselves involve any conscious reflection. I mean, but as it were, there are the immediate steps, and then you put lots and lots of those together, and you get this piece of conscious reflection. And so, what that means is that anything which is not an intuition, is a piece of conscious reasoning. It will itself depend on intuitions, because it's actually made up of a bunch of intuitive judgments in the psychologist's sense. And so basically, every judgment that we make, even if it's not an intuition, it depends on intuitions. And so it's impossible to make any judgment without relying on some intuitions. As they're just, everything that we do in our cognitive life, every judgment we make is either is an intuition, or it relies on intuitions. And so this is not something that's more common amongst philosophers. It's something that is universal in human thought, and that's because of course, this category of intuition, at least as understood by the psychologists, is just so widespread. And I mean, you could try to have a much narrower category of intuition, but I think once you try to make it something much narrower, you either sort of divide it off in a way which is just completely arbitrary, or else you end up not being able to show that intuitions are even involved in philosophy. So I think it's not really something that is distinctive of philosophy. I mean, for example, another case to think about would be the case of mathematics, and of course, mathematics involves lots of conscious reflection, but all the things that we prove in some complicated way by calculation or some other kind of inference, I mean, they all go back to first principles, which are not themselves the product of of further conscious reflection, and so those would count as intuitions. So that in that sense, we're actually, in doing philosophy, where in the same boat as mathematicians are.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It almost gives me this seems to suggest this picture, well, because of the nature of the questions and the tools philosophers have for answering those questions, making explicit the intuitions that they have is going to be salient, whereas it might be less so in other domains. But that doesn't mean that the philosopher is relying on intuitions any more than someone else, right? There's always going to be intuitions in the background, and that's not really a serious criticism.
Yeah, I think that's right, because it's, as it were, in other disciplines there are very salient special features, like in mathematics with the use of calculation or whatever it is. And in natural science, with experiments and observation by microscopes or telescopes or whatever, and so on. So we kind of focus on those unusual aspects of them. But what that neglects is that, as well as those unusual features, those other sciences, they also are using, as it were, the more basic aspects of human cognition all the time, and those are the ones that are being used in philosophy.
Right. Absolutely.
They're more salient in philosophy because there aren't a lot of other eye-catching things to distract us from them.
Right. But if we were to give a full, chain of reasoning for how we come to some non-philosophical conclusion, it's still going to involve these intuitions on some level, even if we don't make them explicit.
Yeah, but I mean, that's to say, at some stage we will be saying things which we're not saying on the basis of a previous conscious reflection. But I think calling them intuitions, makes it sound as though philosophers are sort of claiming to have some kind of mystical faculty or something that they're using, and then that starts to sound like a bit of a scam. But it's really just a slightly mystifying word for a completely commonplace process.
Yeah, I mean, on that though, what do you think of the criticism that intuitions are in some sense kind of arbitrary? I mean, if it's not based on something else, then
well, but I think that, I mean, one example I gave you was by psychologists' criteria, perceptual judgments count as arbitrary, as intuitions. And so when I make the judgment on the basis of sight, that there are some some white flowers in front of me, that's not arbitrary. Now, of course, then there are all the judgments that we make, not at least directly involving perception, but those are often based on some kind of pattern recognition, that we kind of learn that some patterns are bits of good reasoning or whatever, and so something, I mean, so that kind of pattern recognition is very important in mathematics too, and so I mean, I don't think people think that the axioms of mathematics are just arbitrary. I mean, and of course, part of this is that we explore their consequences, and they have some kind of explanatory power, and that's very similar to what happens in logic, where a lot of logical principles are really as it were abstracted by some kind of pattern recognition from successful habits of reasoning, and then but then we can formulate those in a more abstract way and work out a lot more about their consequences. And so a lot of that is going on in philosophy, and and a lot of sort of high level theorizing, where we're putting forward theories to make sense of complicated phenomena, not by as giving their causes, but by telling, again, picking out certain kinds of patterns in them, and unifying various phenomena, and so I think the kind of thing that's going on in philosophy, it's involved in that kind of theoretical process, which it's not at all arbitrary.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah,
it's sometimes mistaken, but I mean, of course, any kind of, in any theoretical enterprise worth its salt, you have to be willing to run the risk of error.
Yeah, for sure. I think I'm on the same page there. I want to move on to some questions related to counterfactual conditionals or subjunctive conditionals in general. I was wondering what you think of the purely suppositional views of subjunctive conditionals, according to which the truth of the conditional depends really only on, given the antecedent, just what is specified in the antecedent, whether the consequent follows, or maybe that's one way to put it, but
I mean, the consequent sort of actually following is too strong, because if I tell somebody if you'd looked behind you 5 minutes ago, you'd have seen Barack Obama. I mean, that might well be true if they just happened to be in the right place at the right time. But it's not that it kind of logically follows from them turning minutes ago that they would see him. That was just a fact about the particular situation that they happened to be in.
We could weaken it to be something as like a probabilistic statement or something like that, maybe, like how likely the consequent is given under the antecedent.
I think in that case, then it's not really probabilistic. It might simply have been the situation that they were in, and so that it might just be sort of straightforwardly true about them, that's what would have happened, so that and particularly in a deterministic world. I mean, of course, there's a question about whether we live in a deterministic world, but in a deterministic world, you can say things about, if the universe had been in such and such a state, then it would have been in another state. And the connection between them isn't a logical one, because it depends on what the laws of nature actually are. But so that it's counterfactuals. I mean, the connections that they're talking about are ones which typically, not always, but typically depend on a lot of background information, but they can still be surefire connections in some way, as with as in a deterministic world.
But but you might think that in that case where we're considering had the world been this way, then this would have followed, or something, where we're considering deterministic laws of nature, for example. You might think that what's really going on there is that we, in the antecedent of the counterfactual, we actually are holding fixed, or we're stating that the laws of nature are the same as they are in the actual world, for example, right? And so maybe the consequent would follow as a matter of entailment, logical entailment.
Well, but I think the thing is that often we're taking a lot of background, we're holding a lot of background fixed, but we wouldn't ourselves be able to specify exactly what it was that we're holding fixed. And so it's, although you can think of it as something like a necessary connection, it's not that we ourselves, were sort of secretly formulating that necessary connection. We were not in a position to say what it was, but in a sense, there's one there. I mean, in my view, what it really takes is just that there's a whole lot, of background stuff which is relevant, which is being assumed, and then that plus if that plus X gives us Y, then we can say, well, if X were the case, Y would be the case, and then but the connection depends on the background, and the background it's not always holding stuff from the actual world fixed? I mean, sometimes we're we're interested in just following out the consequences of some kind of fantasy. So so we might have a fantasy that there's a tiger in the room, and then we might say to somebody if you'd looked round 5 minutes ago, you'd have screamed with fear or something like that. And that's not because we're holding something fixed, because there isn't really a tiger in the room. It's, I mean, we're not holding something fixed from actuality to the counterfactual situation. We're making, so we're talking in a situation where certain things are being assumed, but they're not. What's being assumed isn't necessarily even something that we can fully formulate. It's just something that's kind of implicit in the context.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I mean, I'm trying to think about how I would go about evaluating that sort of counterfactual. I'd be thinking something like, okay, what we're supposing that we're still in the room. The room is more or less as it actually is, with the exception that keeping the same as much as we can. There's also a tiger in the room. I mean. Then considering, well, what's likely, what would be likely given, I don't know, our certain psychologies and so on, and what tigers are like to have occurred subsequent to that. I mean, is that more or less how you would go about doing that?
It's something like that. Something like that. But for example, it wouldn't just be, a tiger in the room, but maybe a tiger. For the example I was giving, it would have to be a tiger. In a particular area of the room, because this is one where we were imagining that she couldn't see it. The person we were talking about couldn't see it, the way they were looking, but if she'd looked behind her, she would have seen it. That depends on the position of the tiger. And we might not be able to, as it were, specify, in words exactly what we're assuming about the position of the tiger or anything like that. But it might still be that some stuff about the position of the tiger is being kind of jointly assumed in the conversation, and then we're talking about what would be the case, if under those circumstances, but where we're not really able to define exactly what the circumstances are in words.
Yeah, and also on counterfactuals, you've written about how the statements appear to be shifty in some sense, maybe changing in value depending on which alternatives are considered salient. I mean, is that something you accept, or what do you think about it?
Yes. So I think that whether a counterfactual is true, it depends partly on what these background assumptions are, and the background assumptions are not given to you in the explicit conditional statement itself. They depend on the context. So, I was talking about a context where, what's relevant is that we've been, say the people in the conversation have been building up some fantasy about a tiger. And that makes it the counterfactual that if this person had looked around 5 minutes ago, she'd have screamed with fear. I mean, that might be true, but if it was, if the background assumptions were different, then that wouldn't be true. And so, and the background assumptions, they're supplied by the context. And, so in that way, counterfactuals are shifty. And I think some people have tried, to in a way to make the background assumptions, a matter that's somehow implicit in the explicit conditional itself. I mean, that you can somehow read them off what the antecedent is and the consequent, i.e. what the X and the Y are, and if if X were the case, Y would be the case. But I think that's not really going to work, because they can change even when you don't change the actual wording of the conditional itself. So I think it's better to understand it as something that's just there in the context.
Yeah, I mean, that might be right. That's a better way to understand it. I mean, someone might try to say that, okay, even if they don't make it explicit in the statement of the counterfactual. Nevertheless, they are assuming such and such in the background, and maybe we should construe their conditional judgment with that in the antecedent or something like that.
Well, yeah, except that this isn't something that they would be able to formulate. I mean, these are, it's not as though these are words that are going through their head, but which they can't be bothered to pronounce. It's just that it's kind of there in the situation. And, it might even be, for example, that the relevant background isn't fixed by one person, that it's something fixed by the conversation, and so it might be that it's something like the stuff that all the people in the conversation are agreed on, but they might not know exactly what that was. I mean, it might be that nobody in the conversation, as it were, is aware of exactly what is in common amongst all the people in the conversation, because all of them might have some as well as the shared stuff, they might have some kind of more idiosyncratic assumptions of their own, and they don't know which of these are part of the kind of common ground of the conversation. So it might be a situation where when nobody, no one person in the conversation really grasps what the assumptions are. It's just that they're a sort of a function of the total conversational situation involving a whole bunch of people who are doing this jointly.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'd have to think about this some more, but yeah, I think that's an interesting point. Another thing kind of related on counterfactuals is that you've defended the orthodox view that on counterpossibles, conditionals with possible antecedents, that they're vacuously true. I was wondering what you think of the approach that, well, what if we assess some counterfactual statement, the conditional of which is impossible. It's impossible in one modality, but we assess the counterfactual with respect to another. So for example, I don't know, maybe some counterfactual statement is vacuously true metaphysically, but not so logically, or vacuously true logically or classically logically, but not so subclassically. What do you think about, this approach to making them non-trivial or non-vacuous make any sense? Give us any. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's something that can be, worked out from a formal point of view, and I think it's attracted a number of philosophers and maybe some linguists because it kind of corresponds to the way that we often react to counterpossibles. So if you take something like an example that I like is that there are two synonymous words, furze and gorse, which they just happen to refer to the same shrub, and there's no real difference in meaning between them. But of course, not everybody who has those words, not everybody knows that they actually refer to the very same shrub. Some people may think that they just refer to similar shrubs and so on. And so you can ask questions like, well, if furze were not gorse, would furze not be furze, or something like that? And and somebody might think, well, surely it would be ridiculous to say that if furze were not gorse, furze would not be furze, because if furze were not gorse, that would just be, well, actually these are different species. But if furze were not furze, then that would be a violation of logic, and they think so that wouldn't follow. And those kind of ways of thinking, they're superficially extremely attractive, and so they make people want to talk about impossible worlds where furs isn't gorse, and because that is impossible because they're simply the same species. And I think what's happened is a lot of people have they've produced a series of impossible worlds where basically just any set of sentences can be a world, where and it's just the sentences in the set are true at that world, and the sentences not in that set are false at that world, and or at least not true at that world. And I mean, the trouble is that when you start trivializing worlds in that way, you end up with a kind of framework which has very, very little explanatory value. You basically just have to put in the answers that you want to get out. It's much less explanatory than a theory of worlds, where you can say a whole lot of things about either P, either a statement is true at a world or it's false at a world, and things like that. So it's, in my view, what's going on is something that scientists very much dislike. It's giving yourself too many degrees of freedom, and as with impossible worlds, you have infinitely many degrees of freedom, because it's just completely up to you which sentences you put in the world and which one you don't. And and it's something that scientists that they're very familiar with. In model building, that if you allow yourself too many degrees of freedom in a model, you can sort of model anything, but the results of doing it will have will be more or less worthless. You won't learn anything from these models. And I think this program of talking about impossible worlds and so on, it's basically making that fairly elementary scientific mistake. I mean, a methodological mistake of just thinking that the more degrees of freedom you have, the better, without realizing how much explanatory power you're actually throwing away by helping yourself to these degrees of freedom. And so I think that the much more kind of constrained theory that I prefer, where we have a really informative theory of worlds and what goes on logically at worlds and so on, which just excludes worlds where contradictions are true and that kind of thing. I think it has much more explanatory power, and you can predict that people would find certain counterfactuals are true or false. I mean, that they would, in particular, that they would find some with impossible antecedents. They would judge them to be false. You can predict that just on grounds of how the cognitive assessment of counterfactuals works. But when you analyze how we assess counterfactuals, you can actually show that built into it is a kind of a method of assessment which is actually internally inconsistent, and that what at the bottom of this we're doing is relying on an inconsistent heuristic for judging conditionals. And so since it's inconsistent, of course, it's not reliable. So I think people, as where people are they're being kind of suckered by their own cognitive heuristics into the sort of illusion that there are these counterexamples to the sort of triviality of counterpossibles, of triviality of counterfactuals with impossible antecedents. And you can predict they would be suckered in that way, but I think once you develop a more powerful explanatory framework, you see that the best hypothesis about what's going on is that it is just an illusion created by heuristics that we have for judging conditionals, which are quite good in some ways, but they're not perfect.
Yeah, that's a very good answer. I think like maybe part of the issue that with these sorts of approaches that you're getting at is that, okay, even if in for these conditionals you can say something more than it's vacuous truth, it doesn't really offer much explanatory power. And if you're using the same logic elsewhere, you'll be able to say much less than we would otherwise be able to say. Or that might be part of the criticism.
Yeah, and I mean, I think another point that's worth making is that when we're theorizing in semantics, a very, very powerful and fruitful constraint is semantic compositionality, which basically tells you that the meaning of a complex sentence is built up from the meanings of its constituents, and ultimately words and or morphemes and the way they're put together, and that's really the guiding principle of contemporary semantics. And when you look at a lot of these theories of impossible worlds, they typically involve violations of semantic compositionality, but that for example, because you can show that the which worlds it's not snowing. It's true at in one of these semantic models with impossible worlds, which worlds it's not snowing is true at is not determined by which worlds it's snowing is true at, or something like that. So that whereas you on the more orthodox approach, you can't get those violations of compositionality. So it's one of the things it's doing is actually throwing away a fundamental principle of semantics. And I think people who take that approach, they're often not thinking enough about what the costs are of just ditching these guiding principles.
Yeah, and what do you think of like non-classical logics more generally? So, for example, J.C. Beale has made the argument that subclassical logics are less committing, have little theoretical cost, and enable us to deal with certain paradoxes and logical issues like the liar sentence and so on. And then they're less committing in the sense that you don't have to say that for any proposition P, not P and not P isn't a we're not committing to that being the case, right?
But I think people often think that it's somehow a virtue of a logic that's less committing. But saying that it's less committing is basically saying that it's less informative. And in my view, the standards for judging logical theories are not so different from the standards for judging theories in natural science. And we wouldn't say that a theory in physics was great because it was less committing, because that would just be saying it was great because it was less informative. But the whole point of these theories is to tell us something, to be informative, in my view, these attempts to solve the paradoxes by changing the logic, they're really working at the wrong level. And I mean, one thing that I've argued in detail is that these attempts they end up weakening mathematics itself, just all pure mathematics. But and so of course that also means that they can in principle they're weakening all sorts of branches of science which depend on mathematics, because the various mathematical principles are invalidated once you give up these sort of the logical framework, which is what people like J.C. Beale are advocating. And and of course, people like that, I mean, their response tends to be, well, we can always recover the bits of mathematics that we need by sort of ad hoc postulations of restricted versions of these principles, which but I mean that's involves a great loss of explanatory power, because part of what explanations are supposed to do is to unify things. But if you give up the general principle and then you just help yourself to special cases of it when you need it, that's not but while still rejecting the generalization, you're not really managing to unify things in the same way. And of course, if it were really true that the only way to solve the paradoxes was by giving up some laws of classical logic, then we would have to do that. But I think people generally agree that in all these cases, it is possible to hold on to classical logic, but then you have to make adjustments elsewhere. And I think what proponents of non-classical logic usually claim is that in some sense they're offering a better bargain, that they're keeping things which are nicer, that the people who hold on to classical logic have to give up, because with these paradoxes, there's always something that you have to give up, otherwise you get into the paradox. But I think that's as it were, they're really making a wrong estimate of what it's most important to keep hold of, because the thing typically with the liar paradox that you mentioned, the thing, if you hold on to classical logic, what you have to give up are principles, or at least restrict principles about how the properties of truth and falsity work, and that they work in a slightly more complicated way than you would like. But the principles about truth and falsity, they're actually much less fundamental in science and in reasoning, because in science you could just be talking about the world. You don't need to be talking about which sentences are true and which are false, even though of course you're using sentences. And so that talking about truth and falsity is a kind of more specialized thing. And so actually restricting terms like true and false, which are in that more specialized discipline, it doesn't actually have such bad effects as restricting mathematics and logic, which are things that we use in every branch of knowledge whatsoever. But
sorry, a lot of good points there. And on that first thing, it's a mistake to think that we really should be focusing on reducing our commitments, right? If that was the only concern, we wouldn't say anything, right?
Yes.
So maybe your point is though that when we're balancing the various virtues, explanatory power, and like simplicity and elegance and commitments and so on, the paraconsistent or the dialectic or whatever approach, I guess you don't have to be a dialectist to accept to use a paraconsistent logic, but that doesn't get it right in terms of the balance of those virtues.
That's right. I mean, this is a slightly crude way of putting it, but people sometimes summarize the kind of theoretical virtues that we're interested in as in science as simplicity and strength. And actually, classical logic is simpler than these non-classical alternatives, and it's stronger than them. So that actually it beats them on both criteria.
Yeah, well, there's different ways to measure simplicity, right? In terms of, is it like syntactically more simple, or is it more simple in terms of the number of commitments, or how are we measuring the number of commitments? Yeah,
but so then I don't think the number of commitments as obviously if they were all independent commitments, but the way in which classical logic works is although I mean we don't need some kind of formula for simplicity. It's really very clear that simple. So, for example, with classical logic, when we're doing the truth tables, we just have two alternatives, true and false. If you look at the kind of logics that J.C. Beale is interested in, for example, then often they will have four alternatives. They'll have, roughly speaking, true and false, true and not false, false and not true, and neither true nor false. And so that in going from two semantic alternatives to four, I mean, there's a kind, it's clear that that's a more complex framework, and which also, by the way, involves giving us sort of more degrees of freedom, and so it's dodgy from the point of view of that scientific criterion as well. I mean, so in natural science, I mean, scientists they do prefer the sort of the simplest theories that are consistent with the data and so on. But they don't use any kind of special algorithm for calculating simplicity. But often it's really clear that one alternative is simpler than another, and you can make that judgment fairly confidently without any elaborate theory of simplicity.
Right. Let's see. I had a question. I think we'll move on to a question I had relating to necessitism, and one, I guess it maybe just as a precursor. Is this a thesis that you still endorse? That everyone?
Yes. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I haven't changed my view on that.
All right. So a common point of contention on this topic, I see it, is that we're sometimes trying to consider which of the following alternatives is more easily dismissed. That the modal logic, which seems to entail necessitism is true, or that everyday objects are essentially concrete. Right? I mean, one of these, it seems that we have to give one of these up, or I guess we could. I guess there's alternative to think that that the concrete objects themselves are necessary, but that's maybe even more of a bullet to bite. But anyway, I was wondering if you think that that's maybe a fair framing of one of the key issues there. And I mean, personally, I find myself more strongly committed to the latter, and I don't know, I can't really comprehend what a non-concrete rock is, for example.
Yes, but I mean, but one clarification is important. Necessitism does not say that there can be a non-concrete rock. Right. I mean, I completely agree with you that if something is a rock, then it's a concrete object.
Right.
But what necessitism says is that let's take this rock, and we say, well, the wood. It would still have been something, even if there'd been no concrete stuff at all in the universe. Right. And what it would have been is, it wouldn't have been a rock in those circumstances. It would have just been something that could have been a rock.
Right.
A possible rock. It wouldn't be. And so the necessitist idea is if it's a rock, then it couldn't not have been a possible rock, but it didn't have to be a rock. It could have been a merely possible rock. And so, as it were, the idea is that concrete things, they could have had this very kind of minimal sort of being in other circumstances, where they didn't have the same physical properties. That basically all you could say about them was that they could have had those physical properties.
Yeah, sorry, I guess I didn't put it quite the right way. Yeah, I mean, what is the thing that we're talking about then? If it's something that could have been a rock, or something that maybe actually is a rock.
So it's a possible rock, but
yeah,
and and so So I agree. It's not as it were the alternative that would you'd have first thought of, or something like that. But I think it's one thing that maybe helps to get an idea about this is to think about the analogy for time. So when let's say we're talking about let's say it's a rock which has been blown to smithereens, so that that now that there is no, it's no longer a rock. There are just let's say just the atoms of which it was made. I mean, supposing it's been disintegrated to that sort of extreme extent. But we can, or even maybe even the atoms have been destroyed, or I mean, if that could happen. But we can still, when we talk about that rock, we can still we can still refer to it, and we can so that there's, when there is an it for us to refer to, but we can ask, so for example, we can ask, we can count past objects. We can ask how many popes were there, who ruled in, who were pope in Avignon or something like that. And so if, they've got to have some kind of being to be counted. But of course they no longer have any kind of concrete being. So, and so as it were, a merely possible rock is the analog for possibility of what we have in time, with something which was once a rock but is no longer a rock, and or something that was once a person but is no longer a person. And I mean, it's still a way of thinking that it takes a bit of time to get one's mind around, but if one's thinking in terms of the kind of fundamental laws of modal logic, which deals with the logic of possibility and so on, actually you get a much more attractive theory if you do go for necessitism than if you go for negation. And although it may be a somewhat unexpected view, I don't really feel that it's in violation of any bit of core common sense, because common sense, as it were, has lots of views about the concrete world, but it doesn't really have much view about the non-concrete.
Right.
And so since the difference between necessitism and its opposite really has to do with what's going on in the non-concrete world, it's kind of beyond the remit of common sense. It's something, at least it's something that common sense doesn't have any special authority over.
Yeah, although I think still a fair amount of people have some trouble really comprehending what the non-concrete world is like. I mean, even if they accept that, maybe there's propositions or universals or something that are non-concrete mathematical objects, maybe. Supposing that there's all these other kind of possible objects as well as maybe a bit harder to understand, or what do you think about it?
Yeah, it's a bit of a stretch, but I think part of what's going on is that people are used to understanding things by picturing them. But of course, picturing is something that is adapted to concrete objects. It's not adapted to non-concrete ones, because it's adapted to, I mean, picturing has to do with with things that you can see.
Right.
And I think in the case of modern physics, I mean, an awful lot of what goes on in modern physics is something that's very, very difficult to to imagine. I mean, with quantum mechanics and so on. And although of course, physicists would, they would love to be able to imagine these things in a more concrete way, but they don't assume that if human imagination runs out, then reality runs out. I mean, they're willing to accept the idea that there may be aspects of reality which we just can't picture, and I think we should be willing to do that in logic as well as in physics.
Right. Yeah. It's a complicated issue, and I guess maybe I don't know. People need to work on thinking about things, or maybe they just accept that our faculty for thinking about these things is still relatively limited, I guess. But that's not necessarily a strong argument against the view. But just to return to that kind of first point, though, and the question, like, it is going to be, we are weighing at the end of the day, maybe at least here, which we find more plausible, the logic which generates this conclusion, if it does, and some other intuitions about possible objects and non-concrete things more generally, right? I mean, and if someone has the sort of opposing intuitions that now I don't need this logic really isn't doing that much for me, whereas these other commitments I have are I have them very strongly. Is there much ground that could be made there, or do you think they're just mistaken? Or
well, I mean, I think they are mistaken, of course, but I think it's, I mean, because many people may may prefer some kind of homely, familiar picture of reality to something that's more theoretically based, and and they'd prefer that in physics as well. I mean, I think I don't think as where I've got any kind of way of forcing people to agree with me, but I think that, I mean, typically when there's a good common sense objection to something, it's something that it's an objection which when you investigate it further can be substantiated in some way. That you when you look into the into the details, you realize that what common sense is getting at is something where in one way or another you can actually get a more definitive argument, which it's as it were, it had an instinct for, and so I think it's in a way the onus is on people who don't find this so plausible to see whether they can turn their general sense of plausibility into anything more substantive, any kind of a more definite objection to necessitism. And of course, if they can, then they're doing well. But if they can't, I think just insisting that they don't find it plausible, when they haven't really been able to come up with a good objection to it, it just looks a bit dogmatic, really, and kind of suggest overconfidence in our primitive human capacities.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. Although, I mean, maybe open to someone to just say, you can construe it as dogmatism if you want, but these are some of the basic intuitions that I have. I don't have
somebody
anything.
Can say that, I mean, somebody can say, look, I've just got a basic intuition that the Earth is flat, and
yeah, yeah.
You can see it's flat or something.
Look around, it's flat. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, that gets into a more complicated issue, maybe of discourse regarding, well, which things should we really accept as basic intuitions, and which should we like push for further reasons on, you know. But that would circle us back to that topic. I did want to.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted to say something more about that, or I had like 2 more questions, and then we might wrap up in around 10-15 minutes.
Okay, why don't you ask your 2 more questions?
Yeah, sure. Actually, I had another question related to epistemology that's going to bring us back to, I guess, one of the earlier things we were talking about, in a way. So I'm somewhat sympathetic to contextualist approaches regarding knowledge attributions. And first I was wondering, and you've written a little bit on this, is that something you think is plausible? I mean, as a sort of necessary condition. I know you don't think that maybe knowledge is analyzable in more basic terms because of that knowledge first view, but do you think that's true of knowledge?
I'm inclined to think no. It's partly that that the examples that people have given, which are supposed to establish contextualism, I don't think are very convincing examples. I think there are other ways of explaining what's going on there. You know, I think also, although I mean, there are definitely some things where contextualism is true, and in fact, I mean, I was invoking a kind of contextualist theory about the way counterfactual conditionals work. So obviously, I think that sometimes context is important, but one thing about this kind of contextual variation is that it actually creates quite a lot of cognitive problems. And so it's a kind of, although it might seem very efficient, it's actually in some ways a device which has a lot of cognitive costs, which have to do with both with memory and with communication, because, you know, for example, in the, you know, we let's say we learn that somebody doesn't know something, and we learn that in one context, but then we want to be able to remember it and then use that piece of information about them. Let's say that they don't know who. I don't know. They don't know the answer or something. You know, we want to be we want to be able to use that information later. But when as it were, when we bring it out of memory, the word "know" will be meaning something different in the new context. At least that's how we'll understand it. But so it's tricky to use it because we're using a sentence which meant one thing in the original context, but now we're using that sentence in a new context where it means something else, but we're still trying to reuse the original information. And you get something similar with communication between different people, where, you know, it means one thing to the person, to the speaker, but then the hearer maybe in a different context, and, you know, and so it means something different to them. And so, you know, if you have terms which vary with context, you know, it's got to be, you know, if we're not tracking the context, then it's very difficult to reuse the information that we get in a different context, because the meaning of the sentence will have changed. And so I don't think it's not that that's you know, a kind of all-purpose killer against contextualist theories, but it means that postulating a contextualist theory involves this quite considerable cognitive cost. And so it's something that, you know, we definitely do some of the time, I think often we do it, in situations where we're fairly clearly aware of it, and which enables us to track the different contexts. Whereas in the case of knowledge, we're not really aware of this kind of shifting, and so we're not in a good position to track the changes which we would need to do in order to reuse the information in a different context. And so I think we would. As I say, I don't think that's a complete refutation of contextualist theories, but it means that we shouldn't really be adopting them unless we've got very, very strong reason to do so. And I don't think that the kind of examples on which they're usually adopted are strong enough to overcome that problem.
Yeah, very good. So like 2 notes on that. One, someone might just accept that, okay, there's maybe a bit of a cost there. But all the same, we can still, it's not completely hopeless. We can track somewhat reliably what the contexts were and sort of reuse them, or even just refer to them somehow in another way, like, well, given whatever the context was on this occasion of the attribution, okay, the person still knows that or whatever. You can maybe fix it in that way. Maybe there's different workarounds. I don't know. Yeah.
But they're not very satisfactory, because one thing is that a lot of the information that we get, we don't track exactly where we got it. We store it, but we don't store a whole story about how we got this information, because that itself would involve a massive cognitive load. And so we know lots of things. We know let's say people's birthdays, but we don't remember exactly who told us or whatever it is. And so I think that the workarounds, if we're to do anything with this information, that they themselves involve extra cognitive costs. Whereas if you have an invariant term, you don't really need to track where you got the information, because the context doesn't matter.
Yeah. Although depending on what the context, well, depending on I was going to say something like, but I'm not so sure about what I was going to say now. I was going to say something about maybe depending on what the context is, maybe the historical stuff doesn't really matter for the attribution, but no, I might have confused myself. I did want to say, though, the other thing I want to bring up on this is that this comes back to that sort of deflationary, well, it's kind of just semantics, it's verbal disputes issue from before. Like, what if someone says that, okay, we can have this sort of contextualist notion of quote unquote knowledge, and we can have an invariantist one, and we can have different versions of each, but not that there's this, I don't know, real relation or thing in the world, knowledge, that both theorists are attempting to adequately describe. They just have different notions in mind, maybe. Do you think, I take it that you don't accept this, but I mean, what do you think about that sort of, what someone might say there?
Well, so the thing is, we've got this term knowledge or know, which it's one of the most commonly used words in English, but I mean there are corresponding terms in basically all other natural languages, and that's something pretty fundamental in the way that we think, and so we've got a lot of capacity to recognize this knowledge, or who knows things and who doesn't know things, and so on. So we've got a lot of cognitive capacity associated with the term knowledge, and the term knowledge, either it's context invariant or it's context variant. It's one or the other. And then if somebody comes up with some variant notion, which they've invented, it's initially going to be something that we don't have any great, cognitive capacity for, because it's just, some kind of arbitrary invented thing. Now, and when it comes to explaining what they mean, they're probably going to have to do that using the term no. So it's going to be kind of parasitic on the term no. But if they they could just talk about something else, which is defined in totally different terms, but then it wouldn't really be competing for the same territory. And then and if when you look at what kind of thing that they define, I mean, very often you can you can put you can put your finger on ways in which it's not going to be so good. For example, if supposing we were to say, oh well, let's just define a new term which works the way that we're kind of unreflectively inclined to use the term no, or something like that, which might vary from context to context. And but that will have the effect that, for example, in this new sense, cases that we, through some kind of glitch in our cognitive system that we classified as knowledge, but which weren't, really knowledge, that they would come under, this new term, let's say knowledge star or something, would apply to them. But we don't really want, to count those things as knowledge because they're not really good. They're just things that seemed good. And of course, we can look at the alternatives, but I think that, the history of people trying to suggest some alternative to knowledge that isn't knowledge, but it's quite similar to knowledge. It's not as though that's had much success. People are they're welcome to try, but I'm kind of skeptical about what the results will be. But of course, we can, when they produce some alternative, we can have a look at it and see how it works. But my hunch is that it's actually going to be worse than the thing that we started with. This is not, and something that's not at all decisive, but it's not insignificant, is that probably the notion of knowledge that we have, that's something that has actually evolved over a very considerable period, because it looks as though even some non-human creatures, like bonobos and chimpanzees and so on, that they have some kind of primitive grasp of what other members of their group know and don't know. And so so it's actually this classification, but the distinction between knowledge and non-knowledge is something that has actually evolved over, at the very least, hundreds of thousands of years. And so, of course, that doesn't mean it couldn't possibly be improved on, but it suggests that there's actually quite a bit going for this distinction, which is so basic to human thought, and also even to the thought of various higher apes, that it's probably a pretty workable and useful distinction if it's survived such a long process of evolution.
Fair enough. Yeah, definitely some really good points there. And so kind of want to wrap up with a more general metaphilosophical question, and just like to ask a lot of the guests something like this. What do you think are some of the the value of and significance of philosophy, I guess, both for you and for society and academics more generally?
Well, so I of course I actually just enjoy doing philosophy, but that by itself isn't enough to justify paying philosophers to do it. But I think if we were, philosophy is some of the most kind of general reflection that we have, and I think, well, just a couple of examples. I mean, one is that philosophy is actually the main intellectual discipline that we have that thinks about questions of right and wrong. I mean, most other disciplines that they say, oh, the fact value distinction and we're on the fact side, but and so nobody much else in a way at the intellectual level is thinking about questions of ethics and morality. I mean, in at least in the kind of general way that they're thought about in philosophy. And I think it's important that we should have some kind of intellectually disciplined reflection on those matters. I mean, it's not that we've come to lots of conclusive answers and so on, but things like whether some sort of utilitarian account of the good is correct or not. I mean, those are things which make a practical difference everywhere. So that's one kind of value philosophy has. I mean, I think another kind, which is it's kind of on the border between philosophy and mathematics and concerns logic, so it's of interest to me, is that there was a long-standing problem in that kind of area of sort of mathematical logic called the decision problem, and one of the people who solved it was the British logician Alan Turing in the 1930s, and he solved it by basically coming up with the kind of abstract idea of a universal computing machine, in modern terms a computer. And then during the Second World War, as many people know, he actually had one of these machines built, and it was used in code breaking and helped to win the Second World War. And and that is what the computer comes from. I mean, it's a slightly more complicated story than that, but that absolutely key episode. It involved the solution to a very abstract problem in mathematical, but also philosophical logic. I mean, Turing had all sorts of philosophical ideas about this as well, and so the kind of very abstract questions which are asked in logic, which, as I say, is kind of in the overlap between mathematics and philosophy. I mean, they've led to something as practical as the invention of the computer, which has completely transformed our lives. I mean, I don't think that philosophy has to be justified, only by these things, but those just a kind of couple of examples about the way that this kind of abstract theorizing actually has, very major concrete effects. I mean, just on the case of the moral one, I mean, the whole idea of human rights, goes back to various philosophers in the 16th, 17th century, people like John Locke and so on. And I mean, the idea of human rights has also had, a great practical influence in various ways. So, so as well as the intrinsic value of philosophy, which I think it's just, the kind of understanding we gain of abstract questions is worth having for its own sake. But there are actually also quite practical knock-on effects as well.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, we often think about, I don't know, there might be some area of theoretical physics that doesn't have or may not have much practical significance, but we're still interested in these questions where we're discovering some ways about how the world is, and that we're interested in those for its own sake. And I think,
and by the way, talking of theoretical physics, Einstein, was famously influenced by Ernst Mach, who was a philosopher as much as he was a physicist, and it was partly Mach's philosophical ideas that interested Einstein. So it's another connection.
Awesome. So I think that's going to be a good place to end off the interview. It's been great having you, and thanks so much again for doing this and taking the time to take my questions and give your thoughtful response.
Thank you for asking them. It's been fun. Right.